The state will miss its pension payment next month and possibly in December. We'll talk about that and more next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine and WUIS. And with me today is Matt Porter, State House Bureau Chief for WCIA Channel 3.
Thank you.
Matt, thanks for being here.
Nice to be here.
And Andy Maloney, State House Bureau Chief for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Andy, glad you're back.
Always good to be here.
So the Comptroller made the announcement this week that the state has finally kind of hit a day of reckoning when it comes to cash flow and will not be able to make the pension payment for November and possibly December. There may be a partial payment in December. They're not really sure yet. Andy, how was this kind of taken? You know, we've been kind of waiting for what the thing that might break the logjam would be. Folks were saying maybe this pension payment announcement when it came. What's the reaction so far?
Yeah, so I think you almost have sort of this automatic revulsion to hearing like another pension payment isn't going to be made or made in full. This was really the big crisis in state government for the last few years, and really ever since pensions have started not being able to make payments. And it's sort of what galvanized the legislature to focus on pension reform a few years ago. But now you're seeing things sort of come full circle with this budget impasse. That's kind of been pushed off to the side, and not being able to make the payment now. It's almost like this is the same thing that the Supreme Court, for instance, last year in the decision knocking pension reform said this has happened so many years, you can't do this. But now we have another budget crisis that is forcing another delay in the payments. There are some questions, I think, from Democratic members of the Senate as to whether this payment can actually be made. They were saying back in August, the Comptroller was making the same sort of argument that cash flow was preventing the payment of disability services and everything like that. But when threatened with contempt of court, was able to find a way to pay those out. So there is some skepticism, but it's sort of interesting to sort of see it come full circle, and now we're having problems with pensions again.
Well, and we're talking about roughly $560 million here that is a monthly payment into the pension system. And the Comptroller has said this is, one of the biggest ongoing, if not the biggest ongoing payment that the state has to make. So, Matt, why is the Comptroller opting not to pay the pensions instead of maybe skipping something else?
Well, I spoke to the Comptroller spokesperson, Rich Carter, yesterday, and he sort of explained what's going on. The monthly payments that the pensions are going right now was set up by the previous Comptroller, and it's not required by any sort of statute that they make these monthly payments. Their requirement is they get all of it paid by the end of the fiscal year. So Rich explained to me they have other things that they need to pay right now by court order, for example, state workers' salaries. So they would rather pay what's been required by court order, by law, and hold off on the pension payments. And they believe that when it gets to the spring and people start paying their taxes again and the tax returns come in, they will get enough revenue to pay the pension payments in full before the end of the fiscal year, which as of right now is the only requirement they have to do. Of course, if we still have a budget, who knows what things will be like in 4 or 5 months.
I thought that was an interesting point that the Comptroller kind of made during the press conference, that in the past, like Comptroller Dan Hines had done this in chunks and sometimes not till the end of the year. So is this really a crisis, or is it just an indicator of kind of a slow bleed here?
Yeah, the Comptroller called it the least of a number of bad options when dealing with the budget impasse. It won't get sort of the immediate attention that the budget impasse is getting, but I mean, there are problems with this. I mean, we mentioned that this is sort of the same type of thing that caused the pension systems to be in such bad shape to begin with over 10, 50, 100 years even. This tension between funding government services on an annual basis but not making the pension payments. But you also have the possibility that the credit rating could be downgraded again. And this has happened before, and it's talked about as a real possibility now that the announcement's made that the pension payment's going to be delayed.
I think what's really important also to make note is while the state is delaying payments to pensions, pension beneficiaries shouldn't expect to see delays anytime soon in their payments from the pension funds. We had Teachers Retirement System say yesterday, put out right away and said, we have enough money in our fund, everything's fine, we're going to continue to make payments as normal despite delays in payments from the state. So while this is big news and this is important and could be a break or back, we're not going to see retirees or beneficiaries going without their pensions in the near future.
And one of the other things the Comptroller highlighted in her press conference this week was the state's bill backlog. And as Matt mentioned, the Comptroller's office hopes to make the pension payments when there's more revenue coming in, in the next year in the spring. But that is also when the state often tries to catch up on that bill backlog. Andy, where are we standing there? And is that going to put us in some trouble because some of that money that would be going to the bills may be going to the pensions then?
Yeah, the bill backlog always seems to be sort of a presence, but one that doesn't get the immediate attention. I think we're not hearing that there's going to be a resolution to the budget situation until maybe January at the earliest. So this thing just keeps progressing, and it's really hard to see where there's an end in sight.
Well, another announcement made this week is that the Illinois Lottery will not be able to make payments out to winners who win a prize over $600. And this is something that folks, if you're not a state retiree or a state worker, maybe would notice even more than the pension payments in some way. What are the reactions here, Matt?
Well, clearly, when the Illinois budget has been on the national scene, one of the biggest stories has been the lottery. We saw it a couple months ago. Illinois made national news when it said it can't pay jackpot winners $25,000 or more. It's making the news again, now $600 or more. And this is going to be, for people who like to gamble or like to buy that lottery ticket, now they're going to be thinking, should I buy that ticket? What happens if I get an IOU? And we already see people suing the state over the $25,000 prizes and larger. Now what happens? Do we see even more lawsuits against the state for not paying out the smaller prizes, $1,000, $5,000, whatever? And one thing if you live on the borders, Missouri, Indiana, Wisconsin, someone who usually buys a lottery ticket, are they going to buy it in Illinois, or are they going to buy it in Missouri? Are they going to buy it in Indiana? And so for businesses, especially on the borders, who like that lottery revenue, could see it easily disappear because those people who want to play the lottery will want to play in a state that's going to pay them out right away, not give them an IOU.
And for the significant number of people for whom the budget mess is sort of an abstraction, this is, like you said, one of those salient things. I mean, one of the plaintiffs in one of those federal lawsuits against the lottery said, hey, if I had a raffle and then I didn't pay the prize, I'd be in jail or sued or both. Mm-hmm. So this is something that even though it's not sort of one of the critical services, funding early education and things like that, it's something that strikes home for people.
Andy, our resident legal expert, if this enough folks kind of pile up here with these winnings, so could we see a class action and maybe a class lawsuit even against the state for lottery winnings? Yeah,
I think so. The class action suit hasn't sort of been laid out yet, but it's always a possibility when you have people who are similarly aggrieved and they can kind of all coalesce and bring the same sorts of claims into a court.
Well, and we haven't, as all the stuff has been going on over the last month or so, been hearing from the governor a lot, but he did have a press conference this week to announce a plan to sell the Thompson Center in Chicago. It's a very large building, takes up a city block, and houses a lot of government operations. Andy, what's the governor's plan here, and why would he like to unload the Thompson Center?
Yeah, the building, in his mind and a lot of other folks, is ugly, it's sort of run down, it's falling apart, and he believes that if the state sort of sells it for cash and relocates the state jobs, it could save something like $6 million to $12 million annually. It's an interesting element to all of this because everybody's known for years that the Thompson Center has been kind of in bad shape, almost like the governor's mansion. Former Governor Thompson the other day said, I tried to get Governor Pat Quinn to put money toward those two things, and on the executive mansion too, he said, I didn't want to be perceived as gilding the lily during an election campaign. But It was built in the 80s for twice as much as it cost, and or twice as much as it was estimated to cost, something like $172 million. Some people think it could be repurposed and kept intact, but I think what the administration wants to do is actually sell it off and open up that prime real estate in downtown Chicago for people.
Yeah, and we've all heard horror stories of, air conditioning not working, it being 90 degrees in there, or the opposite, that it's like snowing indoors almost.
Cockroaches,
carpet
bed bugs, peeling, yes.
All of those things. At its surface, it seems like maybe a plan that could be popular, open up some real estate in Chicago that would be worth a lot of money, might be beneficial to the city because maybe they could charge property tax in the future. But Matt, this has been proposed before by Governor Blagojevich and didn't move forward. What are some of the, kind of drawbacks? What are the Democratic leadership saying about this?
Well, so far, when we asked President Cullerton and Speaker Matting what they think of the idea, they basically said, well, we're looking at it, but we're not going to say one way or the other just yet. Certainly, this was tried 10 years ago, and why, I wasn't here, but why exactly it failed, there was some unexpected resistance, and then Governor Blagojevich wanted to try to just mortgage it, and he didn't have the votes. He needed 3/5 for that. Now, Rauner, it seems, this is what we've been trying to figure out all week. It seems that he has the executive authority. He could put it up for auction. However, there are questions of, there's a major CTA station there. What's the contracts with them? There's also the matter of the DMV. Now, the Secretary of State's office says if he moves us, we move. We don't own the building. It's the governor's call. And there's just a lot of questions of who wants to buy it. It's going to require some demolition. The governor tried to soft pedal that, said it's mostly glass, so it comes down real easily, and build a new tower. But it's going to be a very complex sale, whoever buys it, and the demands that they make as far as how much should the state pay for demolition or clearing it out, because again, it's sort of it's a weird looking building, and it seems like architecturally it might be a little complicated to move. And then the question is, when you look at all of that, how much the developer is willing to pay, and then how much it's going to cost to take all those state workers and move them somewhere else, is the math truly going to be as good as the governor says it is? And really no one can figure that out yet. And I think that's why you're hearing silence from the Democrats, because no one's really sure if this is a great idea or if it's just a political statement to say, look at this waste, let's fix it.
Well, and House Minority Leader Jim Durkin introduced legislation this week to try to kind of fast track this deal. Andy, is this something, though, that we may see just get caught up in the gridlock that is grinding everything in Springfield right now?
Not a lot is happening right now. There's only a handful of session days remaining, something like 2 or 3 scheduled. And hard to say on specifics, but making a projection on a bill going through or not right now, you'd probably be good in guessing that it'll get caught up.
Any thoughts on why the governor is making this pitch right now, Matt? Any speculation from folks? It seemed a little out of left field with all the things that are going on in state government right now.
The governor's just really been hamstrung on everything else. He can't, the budget hasn't been done. He's holding still, but it's really not allowing him to do much of anything, move forward on any other initiatives. And I think this was something maybe that they've been interested in. I think we saw in May, we heard rumblings that the James R. Thompson Center might go on the auction block. And I think at this point, the governor, this was an opportunity to put himself out there and say, here's how I'm trying to cut down the deficit. One other interesting thing is, if it were to go through, one of the biggest benefactors could be the city of Springfield. The governor said some of those jobs may move back down to Springfield, and that could be good for a city that has seen thousands of jobs move to Chicago in the last 10 years. Now, the governor did say this was not about bringing people back to Springfield. This was about a cost-benefit analysis, and he felt that the state can make money off this deal. However, it does have the side effect of maybe sending some state workers to Springfield and doing what the governor had promised, which was bringing the focus of government back to the state capital, not in Chicago.
And especially a way of, as you said, just being proactive in a time where the budget stuff isn't really happening, and we have this sort of steady drumbeat of here's how the budget impact is hurting X, Y, or Z. I think it was a way for him to kind of shift the message a little bit on that story.
Well, and speaking of the governor's messaging, the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute in Southern Illinois at SIU Carbondale put out a poll indicating that the governor's approval ratings have dropped pretty substantially in Southern Illinois, an area that's would normally be, core base for the Republican Party. Matt, you had a story on this week and talked to some folks here in Springfield about, why this might be happening. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Right. Well, again, I talked to people here in Springfield, and I talked to someone who voted for Governor Rauner, and he said, I liked him. I've liked what he supported, but at the same time, he can't support what's going on now, which is just this forever gridlock. People are really starting to see what's happening as somewhat immature. And, one person said, I wish the governor would just sit down and play nice. And I think that's also the other way. I think people are also wishing that the Democrats would do the same, that they would both be able to be mature adults and sit down and talk. Now, that poll, again, was in Southern Illinois, so down in Carbondale area, all that. And that's an area where the governor really did well during the election, but now the poll says more than half, 50.7% of the people in Southern Illinois, registered voters, don't like what the governor's doing right now. Only about 34% said they approve of what he's doing, and that's big. Especially for a governor who is or is not concerned about the next election. The one thing that I think that poll was missing, and I would have liked to have seen, is what about approval rating of Speaker Madigan, President Cullerton? Because I think we would see that those approval ratings would be incredibly low at this point as well.
Yeah, and it's maybe an analog was a month ago we had a pollster associated with the administration kind of put out a poll that said, well, 70% of people say they know Speaker Madigan controls politicians, and a big percentage of people also think that the governor is trying to shake things up. Of course, that is his pollster, and so you might expect those values to be, up a tad more than maybe somebody who is neutral. But it does send some conflicting messages. And I think another poll said over half of people in that same area, Southern Illinois, supported right to work and open shop laws, and that's a union area too. So there are some nuances in the poll that certainly make it interesting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and another piece of that poll was folks from Southern Illinois. I believe it was over a third, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it said that the budget impasse was directly affecting them or someone they knew, family, friend, that sort of thing. So, Matt, is that part of the issue too, that folks are maybe starting to feel the pinch, or their friends and neighbors are starting to feel the pinch of not having a budget?
Well, I think that's definitely the case. I think the more people are affected by the inaction here in Springfield, the more people are going to disapprove of what the governor's doing and what the speaker's doing. But unfortunately, that number is still maybe a third in that poll. It doesn't seem to be enough to convince lawmakers to come back and sit down. And everybody I talk to in Springfield says if there was more people, more of a sense of urgency, maybe people would come together. But right now, 90% of the budget is being spent, and most people aren't feeling the effects of the budget.
Well, and the governor said at his press conference this week when asked about the poll numbers that he doesn't pay attention to polls. At the same time, he did cite support for his turnaround agenda, saying that it's widely supported by Democrats and Republicans. So not sure how he knows that if he doesn't pay attention to polls. But that aside, Andy, do you think that his folks on his staff are paying attention to this? Do you think this is having any impact for him?
Whether it turns into a tangible action is hard to say, but certainly anybody, especially a governor, is going to be aware of those types of things. It may not be sort of first order in the administration. I don't claim to have any inside information on that, but if you're in politics, you're certainly always aware of the numbers and sort of looking for numbers that both go for you and against you. So it's certain, I think, that they know of the poll, even if they're not going to necessarily take some sort of action based on it.
Although I do think when the governor says I don't pay attention to polls, again, I don't speak for the governor, but I do think this governor, unlike many others in the past, seems to be less concerned with the political ramifications of his actions. I've talked with Governor Edgar, I've talked with other former governors and former reporters, and they say Bruce Rauner just seems to be ready to put everything on the line for his agenda, for these 5 items he's talking about, whereas maybe someone else who is maybe more concerned about the next election maybe would have come down and tried to talk things out by now. We haven't seen such a governor stick to his guns for so long and create this long, drawn-out budget process. So maybe he doesn't really concern himself of those polls, at least where he is right now.
It's easy to do a little earlier in your term before that next election is looming. But at the same time, Andy, we are seeing the governor backing some very popular components of the turnaround agenda when you're looking at redistricting and term limits, things that some folks have called him out for maybe pandering to try to get some of the less popular things through.
Kent Redfield, who is a professor of political science, wrote that.
And a friend of the show.
And a friend of the show, a frequent guest.
Probably would recognize, yes.
And he talked about, to the extent that the administration is sort of, holding the budget hostage, or however you want to phrase it, on behalf of getting items like that, it's something like, those types of items won't be implemented for a number of years, 10 years, 2022, 2026. If you're going to say that legislators have 10-year term limits, well, that wouldn't be implemented until after the next election, once it sort of is passed and approved and put into the Constitution. So those elements, I think you could say that he knows they're popular, right? He knows that state government in general is unpopular, regardless of sort of what's happening a lot of times. So it makes sense to support that stuff, but at the same time, he is also lobbying for those 5 items on the turnaround agenda. I think those are the more immediate concern for him.
Well, as we have been doing often on the show and probably will continue to do, we're going to take some time to check in with the kind of drumbeat of budget news that's going on as we continue on without a state budget. Matt, you mentioned before the show that there has been some attention this week on adult education and funding there. Can you fill us in on that?
Right. Well, we've seen a number of protests up in the Chicago area about, funding for adult education programs. Many of them run through community colleges. And of course, as we know, the higher education budget hasn't come through. Universities, colleges, community colleges are all trying to find ways to cut. We've seen hiring freezes at some colleges and universities. We even heard rumblings up at Illinois State University about a threat of lawsuit, something to put in the courts to try to get their funding. Of course, that was said it's unlikely, but again, the funding for colleges, it can't go on like this. It's a huge amount of money that goes to the college system, and adult education programs are one of those programs that I think depend on that state funding every year to manage their way through.
Well, yeah, and universities throughout the state, of course, get funding from other areas, and they've been able to manage so far, but that does seem to be getting kind of heightened as far as the lobbying efforts coming from universities, and concern that the spring semester could be under threat, and some universities, or at least some classes, could be under threat. Andy, what do you think about this lawsuit idea? It seems like something that was kind of just being tossed out there. Would the universities have a chance in the same way that some of these consent decrees and Medicaid and other things that have gone through the courts?
It's a good question. You never, I'll repeat the old axiom, you never know what a court is going to do, but if somebody takes the time and files a claim, they're more likely than not going to get a day in court. Whether or not their challenge is successful, you'd have to see the particulars of the kind of case they'd bring.
Yeah, and we've seen at least one county, St. Clair County, sue the state over the money that the state passes through to local governments. That county has seen other lawsuits that are associated with the budget. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's one in particular that I'm a little bit more caught up on, which is the state employee pay. In other words, the reason that state employees are still getting paid is in part because one of the lawsuits that they brought alleging that they should still get paid is still sort of working its way through the St. Clair County and Cook County courts. Right now, they're amending complaints in St. Clair County, but those decisions saying that the check should still be cut and payments should still be made were really preliminary decisions. If this goes on and the impasse continues, you could see different decisions saying, well, no, they need appropriations, which is what the Attorney General, Lisa Mag, has argued.
Another budget area, Matt, that you said is kind of being highlighted, given that it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month, is funding for cancer screenings. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah, one of our staff members, Kelsey Gibbs, did a report showing that is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and the state's program for breast and cervical cancer screenings, while getting federal funding, and that's an important piece of those programs, is not getting any state funding. And what we heard from the American Cancer Society Action Network this week is that yes, some providers have had to take actions during this time to reduce services, maybe stop accepting new patients, or shutting down for half a day, and that this is happening. And again, these are some of the smaller nonprofit programs that are critical in a lot of areas, but only affect so many people that it's not getting the sounding board, say, like the lottery is this afternoon, this week. So yes, it's something we noticed. It was Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and again, state services to critical services to help for screenings have been hurt by the lack of a state budget.
And Andy, we're going to see lawmakers returning to Springfield very soon. What should we expect as far as what might happen when the legislature is around?
Well, certainly one thing to be on the lookout for is a vote on the Auditor General. Commission recommended a longtime representative, Frank Montino, for that position. There were 3 other candidates. One of them was her Democratic colleague in the House, Elaine Nekritz. But he would need a 3/5 approval from both chambers. I would anticipate that he'll get it, and he's going to be looking to fill some big shoes in Bill Holland, who's one of the most popular officers, constitutional officers in the state.
Montino, a member of leadership, pretty tight with Madigan in the past.
Right, yes. This was somebody that the speaker said would have his support, and so far I haven't heard more than the one dissenting vote in the Legislative Audit Commission that said, we should put forward his name as well as one of the other candidates and give folks a choice. So it would be very surprising, I think, to see too much dissent on that.
Yeah, and some of the coverage of that seemed to indicate that maybe it was a bit of a rubber stamp, that sort of thing. But if folks will remember, Bill Holland was a fairly partisan person when he took the job, and then seen as very even-handed. So we really don't know what to expect out of whoever ends up in that.
Right, and you would think that his long tenure in that office has sort of set the bar for sort of how to go about it. I think given that precedent, it may not be as much of a concern for people as it was a quarter of a century ago when Holland was initially nominated.
Well, Andy, we've got just about a minute left, and I want to take the time at the end of the show to remember someone who was lost this week that folks who follow, especially legal issues in Illinois, will probably know well. Joe Tiber. Can you tell us a little bit about Joe?
Yeah, he was a longtime Illinois Supreme Court spokesman. Got the job in the late 90s after a very extensive and successful journalism career. He passed away, unfortunately, last weekend due to a bout with pancreatic cancer. And for all of us who pay attention and are around a lot, we deal with him. Hard to find somebody who does the job as well as he did, and our thoughts and prayers are certainly with him, his family.
And we'll have to leave it at that for this week. I'd like to thank my guests, Matt and Andy. Thank you for being here. And I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues. And we'll see you next week on Capitol View.